keep the goal in mind defined, small, and bring in passionate people.
One of the things that I found very useful is if you're in a position of some kind of authority over a certain area. So in my case, it was the Internal Revenue Service and network security. If you get your name out there enough, what will happen is if somebody wants to report something, finding who to report it to is always the first problem an informant will have. Who do I call? So if they do a query for IRS or Internal Revenue Service special agent, back then my name would probably bubble up to the number 1. So I got a huge amount of information from that. And when we started getting hit with the phishing, I was the one that came up with the idea of why don't we create phishing@irs.gov. Now today everybody does that, but way back then there was no other federal agency doing something like that. There's a ton of data that people forward to phishing@irs.gov, and sometimes they get asked, why did you send this to us? It doesn't have anything to do with IRS. And they'll say, well, because I didn't know where else to send it. So it's very, very important if you're in a position where you want to cultivate information, you have to put yourself in a position of some third party that has no knowledge of you or your organization. How would they find you? If they had information, how easy would it be to get it to your organization? And that actually turns out to be pretty important.
There's actually another model. If you're actually just starting up, if you can recruit directly yourself. There's a man here in Las Vegas named Jeff Jonas. Some of you have seen him on the IBM ads. But he started a company that focused on something called non-obvious relationship analysis. And so imagine when you, and he was working with a computer, with the gaming industry. So instead of having somebody send in their paper records and have somebody process them, he would say, I bring the following records to the center, to the hiring center today, and have this information. And it would, so you bring the last 5 years of residence. So when you type in, it would say, when you type in 123, River Terrace, it knows right away that that's an apartment house. And so it doesn't let you get further without putting the apartment number in. And it has various algorithms for checking social security numbers. So if you transpose a digit, there are ways to cross that, reference that against your name. But then it lets the companies ask questions like, the phone number you listed for yourself 5 years ago is the same phone number as a known card shark. Or ask questions like, how many people in the purchasing department have personal relationships with vendors? And actually, one of the companies here went through it and they found that over 100 people in the purchasing department had personal relationships with vendors, and 17 were vendors. They were buying from themselves. And so if you have something targeted like that, and he's done some very interesting work with something called data hygiene, which is, for example, they've taken all 128 spellings of Muhammad and normalized them so that whether it's spelled M-M-E-D or M-E-D or with an H or things like that, they can figure out this is the same person. So there's actually been some very good work done in the private sector in this that might be applicable to what we're talking about.
I was glad to hear John kind of talking about passionate people, because heaven knows there are a lot of passionate people here in Las Vegas, but they're not all patriots. And as far as passionate, brilliant, and patriotic people, one thing I'd like to leave with you is 2 URLs if I can. The first one is NC4, and the second one, well actually I'm going to leave you 3. Another one, the second one is all.net, belongs to a friend of mine by the name of Fred Cohen. Fred did the original research on computer viruses back in 1984 for his PhD at the University of Southern California. Very interesting guy. I met him when I met him online. I didn't meet him online, I just saw a website and it said 50 ways to hack the World Wide Web, and I thought I need to get to know who this guy is. And this was in the mid-90s. And so I did a little collaboration with Fred, and he invited me to put on some of our training programs out at Sandia National Labs in Livermore, California. And we were putting on a data mining training program for the Department of Treasury. It was the first one. And I wanted to hand something out to my students. And I kind of used that 50 ways model that Fred had. So I drafted 50 or 20 items on what I call 50 ways to protect your information assets while surfing the internet. And I put 20 in, and 15 minutes later, Fred sent 30 back, and it's still sitting out there if you want to take a look at it. And I'd be interested in some pushback from those of you, because It's interesting how many of those 50 items are still relevant today. It's called 50 Ways to Protect Your Information Assets While Surfing the Internet. And the last one is Project Vigilant, projectvigilant.us. And I would urge you to take a look at that site if you are interested in this whole issue of attribution. An incredible team of people that's been pulled together on a volunteer basis. And if you're interested in that, I'd be glad to talk to you offline. I'd be glad to introduce you to the fellow who is really the genius behind this. His name is Chet Uber, U-B-E-R.
Thanks, Kevin. To echo what Lynn had said in terms of getting all this disparate information and what's non-obvious actually being relevant, you know, if you look at things in, again, to use the term full spectrum, physical and virtual, I mean, if I'm going after a person and I have a virtual entity going after him with some particular thread, maybe I sent the fashion guy after him because I know that this person is into fashion, and then I coupled that with a Formula One persona, and I coupled that with a business acumen that person might be interested in. And then, oh, by the way, I was able to get his speed pass or his fast pass on the freeway there, so when you go through the toll. Now I'm really bringing in all sorts of different aspects to this equation. I'm bringing a cyber piece, but I'm also bringing a physical piece. I'm getting a pattern of life when this guy drives, and you know, maybe there's some geo-fencing going on, so with his cell phone, etc. So there's all different levels to look at this, and I think the key to come up with the best solution is if you can get a bunch of different practitioners from different backgrounds together, and those being non-obvious, as Lynn said, and they work towards a common goal, you'd be very surprised at what come out, you know, what transpires. I run innovation drills for companies and things, and when I pull the mom that runs a cupcake factory in with the guy that's a carpenter in with the advanced programmer that never leaves his basement, you get some really interesting discourse going on, but in the end you get a really interesting end state that I just don't think would have arrived there if you brought 15 SEALs in a room or 15 law enforcement people. We are entering the world where it's no longer a-dimensional expertise. We are entering a world where the most valuable people are those that maybe are jacks of all trades, obviously masters of none, but they have enough competency to know when a different capability. So I would just ask you guys to keep that in mind. Gone are the days of straight, you know, single-dimensional expertise, and enter the days of when I can bring people in that have many different perspectives on things.
So one of the other things I think is worth mentioning is that when we do get informants, it's very, very important at some point to do some kind of cursory monitoring. I remember about 20 years ago a problem in Central Florida where there was a couple fires. And it later was found that one of the volunteer firemen was setting them because he wanted to be able to be first on the scene and talk to people about how he put the fire out. We have seen in the past where informants have gone overboard after the initial information they wanted to relay was handled, everything was done. They kind of wanted to stay doing the stuff. So they'll start coming back with more and more information, but you have to make sure that they're not in the process of generating some of this work that they're reporting. And I've had conversations with other law enforcement agents that have said that their informant went out and started soliciting people to do stuff so he could turn around and report it and make money. And I think I said that, you know, the paid informants are probably the sleaziest and the ones that really have to be watched the most. Yes, sir.
You've talked a great deal about trusting informants, and I'd like to reverse the equation. I do breach investigations in California, and that's what I've been doing for the last few years. I'm a licensed investigator, and in Silicon Valley mostly, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a more paranoid group of people than Silicon Valley executives. There have been many times I've recommended they talk to the government. They advise them of what's happened. They try to keep it a secret, and there usually ensues a discussion in a room about why should we trust those people. Many of the people that I work with are from my generation or a bit older, and they grew up during COINTELPRO when the federal government was pulling dirty tricks on ordinary Americans, illegal surveillance, you know, getting them to lose their jobs because they said something that they thought was subversive at a PTA meeting. So that's one thing that impacts people. I've heard stories about how they'll turn it around and leak it, and they're full of the feds are riddled with rogues and leaks, and they can't get any internal, or they can't get any international informants because they keep getting them killed or arrested. Why should they trust you?
So the real question is, why do they trust law enforcement to come forth with information? I've not been in an arena where that has been a problem, but I can tell you that when you look at, say, banking industry or large corporations that have had internal problems and have a reluctance to report them because of publicity, there are some ways that can be delicately handled. There have been arrangements made with people that came forward that said, listen, we're one of many that these people are hitting. We can't press charges because it'll ruin our reputation, but we still want to give you the information. And we've actually had a lot of people come forth with that kind of information. The problem, however, is that for everybody that's a victim, if they don't report it, they're as much at fault for these people to continue hitting the next person. I think the analogy was, if a woman doesn't report being raped, then she's guilty for the rapist going to the next person kind of theory. There are some laws that require some companies to report certain things. They have no choice. But I think in most cases you're going to find that if they approach law enforcement and ask for the ground rules before the information is provided, they'll be given an honest assessment as to what can or can't be done and what they can expect. And I don't know if anybody's going to lie about it, especially at the FBI level. I deal with those people all the time. They're honorable. They understand what it's like to have to continue doing business beyond this one case. They're not going to jeopardize that relationship by doing it. It's a tough problem when you have your corporate espionage or other things that would inhibit somebody from coming forward. And really that's where you have to talk to one another and say, we have a problem, but we can't talk about it. But if we were to tell you this, what could we expect? We're concerned that this is going to happen. Is there any way to mitigate it? And at some point, either the law enforcement officer can work around them and get information, or they can cooperate, or just not follow up on it and hope the next person is willing to report it.
So one of the areas I've been most disappointed with in this collaboration and trust has been something that came out of Presidential Decision Directive 63 back in the 90s. It was called the ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. And the idea is that this would be a vehicle, a forum, where the government could share information about what was happening as threats emerged, and the industry could come in a trusted environment and say, well, this is what's going on in my network, and others could say, yeah, I see that, and it would all be a non-disclosure. And so, well, by and large, that has not worked out well for most of the sectors. And so we asked about a couple of years ago, why? Because we're trying to find a way. It's essential to making it work. Some industry people said, look, we came down to Washington a couple of years ago, this was about 2 years ago, in response to a request by the administration to try to reestablish trust. And recognizing, and so here's a long table. And the govies are sitting at the end of the table, and the industry people are sitting along the side of the table, and their point was, we own this infrastructure. You don't own this infrastructure. This is private sector infrastructure. And not only do we not have confidence that you're competent to protect this infrastructure, but you're sending us totally the wrong message that you're in charge, as opposed to this ought to be a partnership that we would work with together. So I think from a government standpoint, the optics at least, and then the substance needs to change to recognize that there's more of a balance we might have had in the past. And that probably is not quite the same as the law enforcement, where you do have a recognized authority of the law enforcement people, but still this whole idea of public-private partnership, I think, is something that needs more attention.
I was very fortunate because having worked for the IRS, everybody trusted us.
You worked in?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So as I've heard several times over the last couple of days and in past conferences, one of the big issues with this public-private thing is the ability to credential who is authorized to communicate with the federal agencies back and forth. So I was curious, what is the penalty if you lose your federal ID, and what happens to you in that situation?
I can tell you what happens when you lose a passport in Bavaria. You run down to the bakery the first thing the next morning before they open up.
Okay, so